Good afternoon, everyone. This is Teacher Talk. Teacher Talk was initiated into the county by Rosette Varner-Wiley and myself, Kashia Thorpe. I am the LifeChanger of the Year for 2018 to 2019, and I'm also the current Global Teacher Prize winner. And Teacher Talk is under the leadership of Mallory Manash in partnership with Prince George's County Public Schools. And this is also sponsored by the National Life Group LifeChanger of the Year program. Teacher Talk covers a variety of relevant topics to today's K-12 school employees, including remote learning, social emotional learning, and any other social justice topics. During these sessions, PGCPS teachers and teachers from also the DMV, we actually share thought-provoking ideas and insights, and allowing our other teachers and administrators and all levels of staff, school staff, to collaborate, share best practices, gain experience, and even network with each other. So today, I hope that you have a wonderful experience, and please share with us in the chat. Our topic for today is civic engagement and amplifying students' voices and teachers as change agents. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome our illustrious panel, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves to you. So we're going to go ahead and start off with Rochelle.
Good evening, everyone. I am Rachel Thomas. I'm currently a middle school teacher at School Without Walls at Francis Stevens in the DCPS school district.
All right, thank you. And then we're going to go with Sarah.
Good evening, everyone. I currently serve as the Professional Development Coordinator with the Washington Teachers Union with 22 years in DC Public Schools as an English teacher and librarian.
Awesome. And Jesse, go ahead, Jesse.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jesse Velarde. I'm an assistant principal with Prince George's County Public Schools at High Point High School.
All right, thank you guys so much for introducing yourself. And we're just going to go ahead and just jump it off. And when we think about civic engagement, we think about qualities that students bring into the classroom, not just what teachers bring into the classroom, but we think about students first, right? So we're going to go ahead and ask, just throw it out there. And Jesse, what is global competence? What is global competence?
So global competence to me is a sense of how much you know yourself and how you relate to the world. And then how do you take that knowledge and then apply it to global solutions as well as global problems.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to just jump in and share what you think global competence is?
Yeah, I would say I definitely agree with that. I think it's students knowing not only the world around them in terms of their community, but also better understanding the greater scheme of things as we are more globalized society.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So Sarah, do you want to tell us, how do we prepare students to be globally competent? How do we prepare them to be globally competent?
So this is definitely a core mission that I've held dear to my practice and also working with educators as well. And so the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they have a framework. And this framework for developing globally competent students is a really helpful one, actually. And one piece of it is having students that want to learn, right, about issues and global issues, so that curiosity piece. Another piece is about understanding different perspectives and worldviews, that empathy that is so central. A third piece is how to interact, and this is especially important in light of what they're seeing in politics and social media and entertainment, and that's to be able to interact successfully, effectively, and respectfully with others, especially around controversial topics. Then finally, a fourth piece is taking responsible action. That part that is a key component of the social studies C3 framework, which is looking at the information, the analysis, all the things building up that global competence, and then working towards collective well-being, not just putting the individual at the center.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. You know, when we think about global competence and we think about those core values that surround global competence, you know, I think about my students, right? So when we think about, world issues and, you know, that level of critical thinking and that understanding each other's values, I think of my students at international high school, where my students, almost do not have a choice but to be globally competent, because they're thrust into this world where we have a multicultural school, and they have to immediately learn how to get along, learn how to be tolerant, learn how to respect each other's views, and just learn how to think outside the box, and just learn how to understand each other and each other, where each other is coming from, and thinking also about, the stories that the things that they have in common. So thank you so much for sharing that. That is so important and key to, when we think about what global competence is as we prepare students for the 21st century, and to be global citizens as well. So,
and Kashia, could I add something in? Because what you
sure, go
said
ahead.
made me think of something when you talked about your students being the core, because I feel like at the core of building global competence is knowing your students, but then also your students knowing themselves and all those different pieces of their identity and how they're going to intersect and overlap and converge. And once you understand that about yourself, you bring that lens to interactions with others in many different settings.
Definitely. So Jesse, jump in for a second, Jesse. How do you think that a school system can actually help prepare students to be global thinkers and problem solvers? Because that is also at the core of global competence.
I think some of the things that schools are already doing is doing things like promoting green schools, really taking a look at what are some of global issues and how do we solve those problems within our own school. Some of the other things that I think the schools can do is also offer through their CTE programs opportunities to do work within the community. So let's say you have, say, a construction class. Having the construction class go out and build something like a park, taking a look at what are the needs in the community, and then going out and helping people. So utilizing the classroom, taking a look at the classroom not only as a classroom, but seeing the whole world as your classroom, and thinking about how can you have students step outside of their class and apply what they're learning to help their community.
One of the things you pointed out is key when you say community, having students understanding their community, not just the community around them, but their global community, understanding that they are key players in not just their community, and whatever they do locally also have global impact, and global things also impact us locally. I mean, think about when we think about Ukraine versus Russia, right? And when we think about how now that the U.S. will also be having immigrants, have some refugees coming in quite a bit, thinking about how that's going to impact our environment, our schools, our communities, and how do those people come in and be integrated also into our classrooms, into our school system. It takes a lot of global competence to think about, understanding and empathy. I think Rachel talk about empathy earlier. How do we empathize with their situation and understand and be tolerant, and just have an open classroom where students can come in and feel safe and belong? Yeah. So I'm going to throw this one out there. What do you think we can do? Well, what do you think we can do more to make sure that our classrooms are more globally competent?
I do think the concepts or interactions don't come easy when it comes to talking about global competency, but teachers would have a definite missed opportunity if we didn't explicitly teach it. So modeling it within our buildings and making sure that it lives in the forefront, and not just something that's black and white on paper, but something that is actually exercised in the dynamics of the classroom, so students can see how to be globally competent.
Sarah brought up something about empathy, and I heard you just say it too, Rachel. And one of the things that I've seen works best in schools for students is teaching them on embedding SEL throughout the day, throughout the lessons. PBIS is a great way to do that, but whatever the school culture is and whatever the school climate is, reinforcing that, because it's that empathy that they'll take into their adult lives that will allow them to be able to become globally competent citizens.
And you're so right, Jesse. Global competence is not just about school. It's about how do we prepare students to be global citizens? How do we prepare them for real life? Because at some point, once they go out into the working world, or even in school, because schools are doing travel abroad programs now, like colleges. And so some may travel while they're in college for different college programs, and some may also travel for work. So how do we prepare them for that? How do we prepare them to interact with other people who they would otherwise not interact with in their classrooms or in their communities, and make sure that they are prepared to be in those kind of environment and still be successful? So Rachel, so do you think that in a multicultural classroom, students are more prepared to be more globally competent because of the diversity of their classroom versus classrooms that present themselves to be more or less diverse?
I think it's twofold. I want to say yes initially, and I think your example of your students is a prime example of how they can grow in a smaller microcosm of what that looks like. But I don't necessarily think they, as students, are fully aware of the power they possess when it comes to being globally competent. So like I said before, it could be a missed opportunity for an educator to address it outright or explicitly teach it if they just assume because their classroom is more diverse that they already have that skill.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I think I could jump in on this one because many schools in DC are 90 to 95% African American. And so I think that sometimes people will look at that context and they'll be like, oh, that's not diverse. But I think, when you push and you press, you find like many different cultural backgrounds, many different values and ideological viewpoints. There's so much diversity that's under the surface when we just look at appearances, right? So I would just add that in.
Yeah, and to your point, that's why it's so important for teachers to kind of like go under the hood at the beginning of the school year, get to know their students, their cultural backgrounds and so on. And to your point, when you think about a lot of those African-American students, their parents are from Africa, their parents are from the Caribbean and different places in the world. And they're growing up in those cultures. Those cultures are present at home and they bring those to school. And so if we're not capitalizing on those, we're missing out. We have to figure out how we bring all of those voices in conversation, right? This brings me to ask, how do we then amplify students' voices? Now that we think about all of the voices that are in the classroom, how do we, when we think about civic engagement and bringing out students' voices and giving them a voice in our classroom, how do we take that outside? How do we take that outside the classroom and how do we amplify their voices? Sarah, you want to jump in?
Yes, but I wanted to make sure I saw Jesse had his hand up, so I wanted to make sure.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Jesse. I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
All I was going to say was like in terms of global competence, where I work at High Point High School, we're an incredibly diverse school. We have 36% of our student population are English language learners. Close to 67% are Latino, and then we have a mixture of other people from all over the world, Africa, India. And one of the things that I've seen in such a diverse environment is this clashing of cultures where kids don't really know much about each other. So one of the things that I was thinking about, that would be cool is helping kids and making a part of the curriculum, helping kids to be able to explore these different cultures and having students share their own experiences. And I think in that way, because it's kind of like get this microcosm, this laboratory that you, so to speak, that you could use and just have kids share their experiences and in that way create a global community, which I think is unique opportunity.
And I think Jesse's response leads really nicely into this question about amplifying student voices, because placing their experiences and their voices at the center, like as educators, sometimes we just have to pass the mic, right? Like gone are the days of sage on the stage, because the one doing the most talking, guess what? That's the one who's doing the most learning. And so I feel like if we incorporate pieces into the classroom that really center the students, then it transforms it. I mean, I feel like the educators who are in the Zoom could probably co-sign on this, that when you put in voice, opportunities for choice, and then you also celebrate and you rejoice with your students, then you have won them over. So I feel like that amplification, it may feel very uncomfortable for some of us to sort of step back, but it's always amazing to see who steps forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses. I really appreciate that. So, when we think about amplifying students' voice, it has to begin somewhere, right? And that begins in our classroom. Like you said, Sarah, we have to figure out how to bring those voices together. And we have to learn how to engage voices in our classes, because, in my classroom, I have students from the Middle East. And of course, we know that in the Middle East, women's voices are suppressed. But how do we figure out how to empower those voices and at the same time still respect their religion, their culture, their cultural backgrounds, their traditional practices that they still want to keep, respect them at the same time, but making sure that all students' voices are still heard, and empower them and let them know that they also have a voice in the classroom. So why is it important then to amplify students' voices? Why is it important? Why is it so important that we give students voices?
To let them know that they're valued as well, that they're, far as appreciated. That's one thing. And the respect and rapport you set day one, and to acknowledge those diverse backgrounds that they're coming into the classroom with. And that's one thing that us teachers need to compliment and set that tone for all students that's appreciated with that diverse backgrounds, because they're coming from different walks of ethnics, different things that's occurring in that day-to-day environment that's not being accepted. So coming into the classroom, we need to set that tone day one to acknowledge and to respect and rapport with those diversities.
All right, thank you, Dana. And Dana Johnson is just joining our team. Dana, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself really quickly?
Yes, hi, my name is Dana Johnson. I'm a 6th grade science teacher at Greenbelt Middle School, and I had the chairperson for PBIS, and I teach ESOL as well, as far as with 6th grade science, but I teach all grades, all ethnic, but my foundation is ESOL.
All right, thank you, Dana. Thank you for joining us today. All right, so like I said before, it has to begin somewhere. So where do we begin? I believe that when we're thinking about civic engagement and amplifying students' voices, that begins from curriculum design. That begins from your designing your curriculum intentionally, right? And it has to be intentional, because it just doesn't happen organically. So well, I can't say it doesn't happen organically. For some people, it does happen organically because we're thinking students first. But for others, you have to really embed those intentional activities or strategies and to make sure it's happening. So I want to say, how do teachers design that curriculum that empowers students to use their voices? What do you do? What are some strategies? What are some ways?
I think, kind of piggybacking off what Sarah had said about teachers letting students have student voice and being uncomfortable with creating that space for them, they have to prepare themselves. Like it comes with researching. I'm currently unpacking Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond, and understanding that you don't have to recreate the wheel, but you have to do the work to understand what your students need, but also knowing what that cultural knowing the deep culture of the classroom. So I would definitely say that in the learning environment, within the book, understanding those deep culture things help teachers prepare for the values of the students. They help set up and prepare the classroom for the conversation before it even happens. So some of these difficult conversations that are coming up, they would be best prepared for it by doing the research themselves.
Awesome. Anyone else want to jump in?
Sure. At High Point, one of the things, in particular in my social studies department, one of the things that we're working on is teaching not so much about content, but rather focusing on skills. So looking at, I always start out by asking teachers, what will your students remember of you about your class when they're 30 years old? And that led us to have a discussion around building skills, things like cooperation, things like reasoning, being able to do that, and then creating cultural relevance around the material. So in social studies, if you're reading something about World War II or something about the US, for a student coming from El Salvador or Honduras, how do you make that come to life for them? And in that way, you allow them to have a voice and be able to relate to the material, but also start to create a bridge now into their adult life where they can use those skill set that they're utilizing to be globally competent citizens. What it comes down to.
Yes, I definitely agree with you, Jesse. One of the things I always say, think about when I'm doing my curriculum is, now where do my students fit in? What are my students going to do as a result of what I'm teaching? How are they going to take it out into the real world? How do they transfer that learning into real world practice? Because students are not just here to learn theory, but how do we make that more practical for them? How do we engage them in their community and show them that what you're learning in the classroom, you can transfer that skill into your real life? So I have projects like actually right now we're working on a project, Russia versus Ukraine. And my students are actually doing videos, and we're going to be doing a civic engagement piece where we're going to invite community members to come into our classroom to think about what's going on outside and what we can do locally, because there are refugees that are going to be coming in, and some of them may come into our own communities. So how do we welcome, we have knowledge of that, right? That's part of the global competence, knowing that these things are happening across the world, but how do we take action and be a part of the solution? And so that's one of the things I'm teaching my students to do. They're all picking specific issues that are a result of the war, and then they're actually coming up with real world solutions on their own. How can we address these issues? Dana, go ahead and jump. Rachel, go ahead and jump in.
Just quickly, when Jesse had mentioned the CTE and how students can get those real world applications, I was taking notes and I was thinking about, like, they see it for face value, but at the end of the day, they're going to be able to identify what barriers are presented, but also who is there to help them or support, the end cause. So I think a part of them doing projects like that is like being able to move past the hard parts, so they're not dependent on the teacher or dependent on family or dependent on their community. They're able to move past that in a more independent learning style as well.
I can say we have that synergy going now because Rachel made me think of, especially because thank you for giving how you are modeling explicitly the whole process. Because Rachel, you talked earlier about how not assuming students can already do something just because they care about a topic or may have certain perspective, that they're able to actually put it into action. And so what you mentioned, Kashia, that students really appreciate in building global competence and civic engagement is they need authentic scenarios, right? Authentic audiences that are going to hear and listen to their ideas, the potential to actually implement their ideas to make a change. I know that there is this general feeling that young people are apathetic, but I highly disagree with that. And I challenge educators everywhere, right, to try to make these more authentic experiences and see what happens in a classroom where you feel like the students might be apathetic or disengaged.
And I'd like to jump in too and say cross-curriculum should be added within our curriculum as well, cross-curriculum. And that's what we're doing at Greenbelt Middle School. We're doing cross-curriculum with science, biomes, like regions, different parts of the globe, along with social studies. They're doing as far as the different regions and areas that correlate with the biomes. And then the reading teacher is doing her part as far as the research. And we're doing cross-curriculum, and that's really helping out with our diverse learners.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned cross-curriculum. That is so important. And like I said, when it starts at curriculum first, right? And when we're designing curriculum, we have to definitely keep children in mind and how we're going to engage them. And like you said, no need to reinvent the wheel, because there are things there that maybe a psychology class is doing, that a civic class is, that a social study class is doing, or an English class is doing. How do we come together and make sure that we map this out so that students are maybe learning it in one class, and then there's reinforcement in the next class because there's, there are overlaps, right? And so some of the things that students are learning in one class, the reinforcements in the next class makes it twice as powerful. So let's keep moving. So when we think about, I think we just kind of really touched on some of these, like what is rigor, relevance, and social justice, right? The rigor, I heard, I think Sarah, I think it was Rachel talk about is how do we move them up the ladder, push their critical thinking, and the relevance is what we are all talking about. How do we make it relevant to their lives, their background, their culture, and also social justice is pretty much at the heart of this. All of these issues that we're talking about are issues that the community face, and within that gamut of issues lie that social justice. Who is getting what? Where does equity lie? Where does equality lie? Right? And how does it impact those people in our community, globally and locally? So when we think about civic engagement, why do we think it's an important skill in a school? Why do we think it's an important skill to teach in a school?
When I was in high school, I was part of Key Club, and something I haven't seen. I'm from California, so I haven't seen a Key Club out here. But what the idea was behind that was high school students getting involved in civic based activities. And one of the things that we did was we built a park, and I remember the feeling that I got from helping the community build the park, and what that felt like and what that looked like, and how that drove me to want to do more. So I think it's very important for schools to offer those opportunities to help kids feel connected to their community, and also figure out ways that they can give back to the community and help out.
Yeah, I know. I obviously I taught in the District of Columbia before, and I know that one of those things that they have is the study abroad program, and they do that during the summer, and over the summer they do service. They do a lot of different service projects in different countries, whether it be building houses, or are doing Earth Day, cleaning up parks, or just doing something that the community will benefit from. I think it's so important that students, and a part of that is starts with us as teachers and as schools encouraging students to go out and do community service, right? It starts at the small part. And I know that some schools may not necessarily do it with fidelity, but I think we definitely need to start making sure that community service is done with fidelity, that students understand the importance and the purpose of it as well. It's not just, I need these hours to graduate, but it's learning how to be of service to your community, learning how to engage yourself in your community, and be a part of the change, because we have the quote, Mahatma Gandhi, be the change you want to see. And if we want to see change, we have to be a part of that. And we have to teach students how they can also help to create that change that they want to see in their world and beyond, for future generations. So I know Sarah talked a little bit about me modeling that for my students. So I want to hear from you. How do you think teachers model citizenship and also be model citizens?
I definitely think that tapping into your community partners is one way to help students see the value of getting that real world application, because there's a lot of, once they identify their cultural identity, they'll begin to see that there's a lot of things that are invisible boundaries that people operate by. So being able to respectfully overcome those boundaries that could be barriers to how they become global citizens and globally competent through the practice of being able to go into their community and execute some of these civic duties even in their youth, so they can see the value of doing it into adulthood.
Yeah. And I was thinking about PBIS too, because we're modeling character, building up the child in which they're going to be going out to the real world, understanding to treat others and to model how to handle certain situations they might encounter day to day. This might call for them to utilize those character traits: respect, responsibility, being safe, and practicing these character traits throughout their life, and it can carry on to within that community and that within their careers.
Anyone else want to jump in? How do we become model? How do we show our students that we're model citizens?
I would just point to another resource that I've tried to integrate in some workshops and also projects with students, and that's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because I think it creates like a global vision of where we want the world to be and how we can, in a concrete way, work towards that. So I would just flag that as a resource.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And of course, the Global Classroom DC has the Model United Nations, and that's coming up in April. In a few weeks, I think it's April 12th, somewhere around there. So I've actually taken my students to the Model UN before, and it's a great way, because what happened is that at the Model UN, the students get a topic and they get a country and they get to represent that country. And then they get to really propose a real world solution to the problem that that country is facing. So, and they actually carry out the process like the real United Nations, right? And so students get to be in the power seat and see what it feels like to make decisions for countries, and to see what it feels like to be in that position when you're trying to find a solution, and and be able to interact with their peers and work with their peers to come up with solutions that best fit the needs of the population, and also as a solution for that specific problem. So, and again, when we think about model citizens, we think about what are we as teachers doing in our community to make sure that we're showing students and like you said, modeling for students how they should behave. Are we going to town hall meetings? Because that's important. Are we showing students that town hall meetings are important? Are we going to Board of Education meetings? Are we going to, community events like a Black History program or something like that? Are we canvassing neighborhoods? Are we helping to register people to vote? Are we out there helping out for those of us who can translate at public events? What are we doing to show students that we are also model citizens, and this is how we engage in our community productively? All right, so as teachers, I think it's so important that we live that life, so that students, we're not just telling students to do this or do that, but we're real role models, really exemplifying what that should look like.
And I think in your list that you shared right there, you're also exemplifying how students need multiple points of entry into the civic engagement process.
Yes.
Not everyone is an extrovert, and that's fine, right? Like, you can find a way to be civically engaged and make a difference without trying to change who you are. So I really appreciated that list.
Yeah. And PTA too, and PTA as well. I'm sorry, but PTA is very important, because I know I'm part of our PTA at our school as a teacher and educator, not within the community, because I live in the community where I work at. So, and I see a lot of our students and a lot of educators like, how can you live and work? Because I did, as far as many years ago, teachers lived and worked in their communities. So that's why I choose to live and work within my community, so the students can see firsthand me being a role model citizen before them, being in that community.
Yeah, it is so, it's so important. I think gone were the days when we had teachers that lived in the community and teach in their communities, because now we have teachers who come into the community and teach, and then they go home, and students don't see a lot of teachers in their community actually being civically engaged or participating in things. And so sometimes they shy away from things or they just don't know, because they don't have the knowledge. And so we want to make sure that, again, when we're thinking about, I think Sarah, you just said PTA, it is so important because I know that a lot of schools also have student liaisons, right? And a lot of students, schools have students who sit on their budget boards, or there are different boards in the school to help make decisions. That's a way of really integrating student voice and getting them to be civically engaged. I don't think they probably think that is civic engagement, but that because we're teaching students so much when we actually incorporate them into the whole, body of the school, the leadership body of the school. We're teaching them to be leaders, and we're also teaching them the democratic process. We're also teaching them how to solve problems, make responsible decisions. They learn so much just from being integrated.
And Kashia,
yeah,
can I add on just something real quick to that? It reminded me of a quotation that I often use in reference to educators, but I think it applies to students as well. And that's that if you're not sitting at that decision-making table, right? If you're not sitting at that table, then you're probably on the menu. And so the students need to make sure that they are making those decisions. But what has really been a challenge to me now is thinking about how do students create their own spaces too, right? How do they build their own table, right? Take the conversation and make it completely their own from beginning to finish, and their activism and advocacy. Because when students study activism, they'll see that most people started when they were young, like with the little things that build up to big accomplishments.
So why don't we answer that question, Sarah? How do we get students to build that? Jesse, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to share, recently we formed our PTA. It's called High Point Parents in Action, or HPPA. And one of the things that we did was we invited students to come to our HPPA and to share their voice, what they felt were some of the primary concerns that they had for the school and how they wanted parents to help them. So one of the things that was surprising to me was seeing how it bridged, how the parents and the students were seeing much of the same and how they were working together. So everything I'm hearing here is spot on. It was surprising to see that because it's something I've never tried before, and having students go and talk to the parents and having the parents give them feedback was powerful, giving them that voice.
All right, anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it goes back. I recently read chapter 8 of Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse, and it talks about how you can allow students to be able to step up and step back. So creating guidelines for communication. So when they go into these spaces, they know how to articulate themselves and get their points across in a way that shows they're solution oriented and not just identifying a problem. So making sure they're prepared for different types of discourse is important as well.
Definitely. So we were on students quite a bit. So let's jump in and think about teachers for a change. So who is a change agent or an agent of change? When we think about teachers in the classroom and we consider them agent of change or change agents, what does that look like?
I definitely think it's someone who doesn't want to just rest in the status quo. I think, again, it goes back to how we're modeling for students when a problem is identified. One of my favorite professors from Morgan State, M.K. Asante, he always said, once you make an observation, you have an obligation. So you can't just wait for somebody else to come along and take up the charge to change a situation or bring the needs, meet somebody's needs. So I definitely think that everyone can be a change agent, young or old, but it just depends on where they're willing to, kind of take up that cross of, enacting change.
Oh my goodness. I love that quote you said. Once you have an observation, you have an obligation. I'm actually adding that to my portfolio of quotes because that is so true. That's one of the things I tell my students, but I didn't tell them like that. That's fancy. I always tell them, once you see something, you cannot unsee it. You have to now start acting on it because it's there. And you can't just pretend it's not there anymore because you saw it, right? And now it's your turn to come up with a solution to how to fix it. How do we, because you can't leave it alone anymore. It's your obligation now to make sure that you do something about it. So thank you for that quote. I'm definitely gonna keep that at heart. I see Rachel, you want to say something?
No, I'm gonna step back at this time.
Okay, all right. But when you think about recognizing teachers as agents of change, we think about social change. What are they doing to help change their community? What are they doing? And when we think about both, we think about what are they doing in their community, and we also think about how they're impacting change in the classroom, how they are taking what they know and embedding it in students' mind to make sure that students don't just hear it, but students will definitely go on to apply it. And when Sarah talked about the question you asked earlier about how do we start putting that in, we start doing that early. We start teaching students how to resolve conflicts early. I think I've been having some conversations with some colleagues, and we were talking about when do we start? What does early childhood education look like? We have to start teaching students global competency skills from early. So we need to start teaching them social skills from early, how to resolve conflict, how to behave, how to communicate well, how to respect each other, how to be tolerant of each other, how to have empathy to your neighbor, how to respect their space and their stuff. Those things kids need to start learning from an early age. And teachers are the vehicle for social change, and again, if we are going to be the vehicles of that kind of change, then we also need to make sure that we exemplify that, make sure that we're modeling that with our students through our daily lives, through our activism, through our advocacy, through our curriculum, most importantly, when we get into the school.
And it's definitely, like you said, it's not a one and done. Like you're not just teaching it in one grade and then you're done with it, right? Like it's the spiral, which is behind a lot of curricular design. But when I'm thinking of this question, I harken back to a US history teacher I had at Wilson High School in DC. And she had her textbook, she had her marching orders, and she looked at the textbook. She was like, there's nothing in here about Native Americans. And that's sort of where this country starts. So we're going to put this to the side. And we're going to start with Native Americans. And then she was like, now you have to situate who you are. So we're going to do a genealogy project. And she centered us in those truths that were not in the textbook. And we saw how she modeled that for us, that, okay, you do have this protocol and procedure, but you also, Rachel, I'm gonna love that quote about it. Once you make an observation, you have an obligation, right? When you know better, you must do better. And so you cannot go with the curriculum as written if it is not reflecting the students at the center, not just like a supplement or an add-on, because students hear that language and then they think that, oh, they're just like something that's dangling on the side versus being the central and most important narrative. So I definitely think those curricular choices and also teachers that are engaging with families in the community and lifting up that cultural and community knowledge that we don't always honor and center in our practice. So shout out to all the educators who are doing that right now.
Yeah.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for shouting them out, because we know quite a few are doing it, and we just need more to be engaged in it. Go ahead, Dana.
And when y'all were just speaking about that, Rachel and Sarah, I thought about teachable moments. Like you could stop. It doesn't have to be followed by the curriculum every day and every second and every minute. You could stop and make a teachable moment at any given time in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in the office. And teachable moments can be anywhere, anytime. So our students need that. They need that wow moments, like, and that's where they thrive from you and our peers. Well, those teachable moments.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just like to add quickly, I definitely think as an educator, knowing your own cultural identity prepares you to have that conversation. So when I talked about research and understanding how to be culturally responsive, that's how you get to that point. Because if you're not confident in that, you're not necessarily going to be able to bring that out of your students. So it's almost like that opportunity and preparation when they meet, like you're prepared for, what can happen in your classroom, and you feel confident to go off scripts and have these conversations. And then, students don't go home and say, well, my teacher said, and, you find yourself embarrassed because you weren't prepared to have that conversation. So I definitely think like it all ties, you know, into one another, that you have to have that understanding of cultural identity for yourself, because the students don't enter your classroom as a blank slate. They may not be ethnically diverse in terms of, you know, culture that way, but they still come in with some type of culture, and you should be able to honor that in your teaching.
Yes, I definitely agree with you that there definitely needs to be a strong sense of identity and ownership and being unapologetic about it. And know that some of those things will come with resistance. And that's how teachers, we get teachers who are change agents. They know that there is resistance, and they're willing to make sure that they stand up against that resistance, and they, you know, they stand strong, stand powerful, and stand their ground, because they know that there is a larger fight out there, but they also understand what their purpose is, and they're consistently driven by their purpose. I know we're coming to a close. And so what I would like to ask is, how can teachers and students work together to become more global competent and to be the change that we all want to see in the world? So I'm going to go ahead and start off with Jesse.
So I think the way that teachers and students can come together and to be more globally competent is to work with one another. To, you know, we've been through the pandemic. Since the pandemic, you know, everyone's been through something. And having an open heart, open mind to one another, in particular teachers towards students, and by opening that door, also opens the door to students being open to teachers. And right there in the classroom, it starts to form that sense of global competence. Just by understanding that, you know what, we're all going through what we're going through. Let's help each other out, and let's get the job done of what we came here for.
All right, Sarah.
I'm trying my best. I'm a work in progress, but throughout my career, I have tried to really become more of someone who practices distributed leadership and servant leadership. And having that type of mindset with students, it helps to distribute power and for them to have a feel for what that feels like, looks like, and ways in which they can do that in their own lives, which I think can lead to a higher level of global competence, because it creates spaces where you are unafraid to let people in and to share perspectives, because you are going to create an identity safe space for those around you, because you know what that feels like, looks like. I also think that freedom is a constant struggle, right? And we're in it together. It's not for the faint or weak of heart, right? So having a community, whether it's a classroom community, a school community, a network, the actual school, you know, surrounding community, having that collective humanity to lean on is going to make sure that we are all lifted up.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's powerful. Rachel?
Yeah, having a strong network is definitely where I was going to start. To be honest, I'm new to this concept of civic engagement. I'm an ELA teacher by trade, but I see how important it is to embed these into my practice, and I'm learning how to incorporate it more. I started substitute teaching in Columbus, Ohio, and their motto is building global citizens, and that was my introduction to it. So the fact that it's carried on and it's increasing in its capacity has inspired me as an educator. So I definitely feel like having a strong network is where you can not only learn best practices, but also try out where you want to see the work go. So being able to have that is important as well.
All right. Yeah. Awesome. I know we're all work in progress, and I don't think the concept of global competence obviously is not a new concept, but because of the landscape of education, especially in the 21st century, we're seeing more of a leveling playing field in education, where we definitely need to make sure we're teaching more skills to make sure our students have the skills to compete on a global level, not just in our countries or in our country or in our neighborhood or in our communities, but we need to prepare them for the world. Dana?
I would like to share that respect, acknowledge, and model and implement within our lessons day-to-day real world experiences for these scholars will really help out tremendously in the long run for that future, and as well as far as us being educators.
All right, thank you. Anyone have any last words? Any last words? Any last words you want to leave with our teachers out there who are listening, and anyone else who are listening? Any last words, final words in terms of, how do we make sure that this is something that we're practicing in the classroom to prepare our students for their next steps?
I just want to say quickly, I want to thank you, Kashia, for organizing this panel and everyone you work with to organize the panel, and for the other panelists, because I don't know how the Zoom audience feels, but I feel riled up again. And I feel like with the crisis that we're facing in education, with educators, not feeling supported, maybe even leaving this profession that they are called to do. This is a calling, right? It's a vocation. Right. And so I feel like when we return to this type of conversation, this is what keeps me up at night. This is what keeps me going. So thank you so much for having this conversation.
All right. Thank you, Sarah, for pointing that out.
I agree. Thank you for creating this opportunity for us. But I would definitely say start small. Rome famously wasn't built in a day. So see how you can maybe start within your school community and branch out from there, or your home community. But at the end of the day, again, like creating the opportunities for your students, creating the opportunities for yourself to live in this work is where it's gonna, snowball into something bigger.
And I see Ashley put in the chat, she said, certainly, I think it is important to do this on a collaborative space and empowering one another through PLCs, and even one pillar at a time. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. One pillar at a time. Anyone else?
Really enjoyed this conversation and the ideas. It had my mind really moving towards what is the next step. One of the things, teaching social studies is how do you bring that alive to students? It seems like a perfect vector in regards to civic engagement. So some of the ideas that I heard tonight, things like the model UN, I'd love to take that and replicate that. So I'd like to reach out to you guys later and just get some more information on how that's done. So thank you guys.
And as Jesse, I guess one final word from you as an administrator. How do you think that you can bring some of these practices into your school to change the culture, or to further develop the school culture?
I think in regards to global competence, it begins with how we interact with one another, how we interact with each other on a daily basis. How will the students see us able to maybe overcome things that might be challenging. Also, how we overcome challenges with one another. It all begins with the relationships and really being open to, number one, feedback, but then also being transparent enough to be able to share that with your thoughts, your ideas with others, and being vulnerable enough. Because I think it's one of the biggest challenges.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you folks so much. I really appreciate your sharing, and hopefully our audience learned something. And like Ashley put in the chat, one pillar at a time. We're as educators, it is so complex because we have so much to learn, and there's so much to implement and execute and hold ourselves accountable for. But I think ensuring that our students is globally competent, like I said, it starts with the curriculum first. And if you're putting students first in your curriculum, then global competence should come to you very organically. And if it's not organic for you, at least think about it intentionally, and making sure that your students, especially those who are not in a racial classroom, you still think about multicultural, because our students have come from so many different backgrounds, and they bring so many different things. They bring so many different worldviews and so many different perspectives. So hopefully you learn something to take back to your classroom, to make your classroom a lot more dynamic than it is. And hopefully you are also thinking about how you're going to amplify your student voices, how you're going to take those textbooks and take lessons from those textbooks and turn it into real world application for your students. And also help them to take what they've learned, the skills that they've learned in your classroom, into their community, and take it and turn it into actionable steps. So thank you so much again for being here with us tonight. Thank you to our illustrious panel. I hope, again, you have learned at least something today. Please also go to lifechangeroftheyear.org to register for our future session. There is one every month. And please check the PGCPS Express as well for our upcoming dates. And thank you all for joining us tonight. You have a wonderful evening.